Welcome, everyone. Good morning in California, good evening, good afternoon in the East Coast, and good evening in Europe and in Turkey. We'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the Armenian Studies Program and our co-sponsors, the Society for Armenian Studies. This is the second session of the conference, The State of the Art of the Early Turkish Republic Period, Historiography, Sources, and Future Directions. The co-organizers for the conference are Dr. Umit Kurt, who is with the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem, and myself. And also sponsoring this program through their financial support are the Leon S. Peters Foundation and the Victoria Kazan Fund, which are helping to support this conference. Yesterday, we held the first session of this two-day conference, which intends to look at the modern state of Turkey and the development, it's how it came into existence in the period 1908 to 1945, and some of the major events and some of the major parts of that transition. This conference aims to use the historical context of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the emergence of the new state of Turkey to discuss and analyze major issues that played a dominant role in the history of this period. And the emergence of the modern state, the impact of war, nationalism, and nation building, and the role of religion and secularism. Yesterday, we had three presentations. The first was a keynote address by Dr. Christine Filiu of University of California at Berkeley. And what she did was to situate the problem of the study of the early republic. And the problem was that she posed certain challenges, obstacles, areas that need more study. And she gave us a very interesting context and raised some of the fundamental issues facing those who study this early period. Our second speaker yesterday was Dr. Christopher Şekeryan, an anthropologist who explored the concept of secularism and the theoretical framework for rethinking the question of secularism in the early Turkish Republic. And it was a very interesting presentation by him. And then Erdem İlter from UCLA presented a talk on the Ottoman imperial legacy, especially on what is called the general inspectorates and the role that the general inspectorates played in both Ottoman Turkey and then later in the early Turkish Republic. And this was also quite interesting. So today we have three speakers who each are going to present various aspects of, again, this early Turkish Republic period. All of these presentations will eventually, we hope, be published together in a book, which will provide us, again, some new ways to look at this question. Our first speaker today is Dr. Talin Suciyan. She is an associate professor, private docent of the Turkish studies at Ludwig Maximillian University in Munich. She is the author of the book, The Armenians in Modern Turkey, Post-Genocide Society, History and Politics, published by I.B. Torres. The book is the winner of the Der Mugrdechian Outstanding Book Award of the Society for Armenian Studies. It was translated into Turkish by Ayşe Günaysu and published by Aras Publishing House. The upcoming German translation of her book will be released by De Gruyter Verlag. In her thesis, her second book project entitled Either Save Us from This Misery or Order Our Death, she examines extensively the archives of the Armenian Patriarchate of Constantinople in the mid-19th century. And she'll talk a little bit about that, I'm sure, as well. Her paper today is called The Amorphous Abstracted Peasant of Ottoman and Turkish Historiography. And this article was prepared working with Professor Harry Harutyunyan, who is a historian of East Asia, focusing on Japan's early modern history. But his newest book is The Unspoken as Heritage, the Armenian Genocide and its Unaccounted Lives. So this work is a co-work of Talin and also of Harry Harutyunyan. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Talin Suciyan to give the first presentation in our second session of the conference. Talin?
Thank you very much, Barlow. And Harry is also with us. I'm seeing him in the list of participants. And I'll try to share my screen now for the presentation. And I hope everything works well. Let's see. I guess you see the first page, right?
Yes.
Okay. So, when reading Ottoman and Turkish secondary literature dealing with peasantry, villages, and their villagers resemble decoding an equation with multiple variables. In order to solve this equation, one has to start from the very beginning by asking simplest questions first, such as who are these peasants and what does peasantry in Ottoman and Turkish historiography mean? By working on the history of Turkey in the mid-20th century during my doctoral dissertation and on Tanzimat of the provinces in the habilitations thesis, a question that became crystallized was that of the abstracted peasant in the historiography of Ottoman Empire and Turkey, that the data that I was working with was not corresponding or not even conversing with the secondary literature that I have been reading. I had the privilege to discuss this discrepancy, its context and meaning with Harry Harutunian, who read the conflicting realities of secondary literature and the primary sources from a new and a comparative perspective. With his guidance, we decided to work on the meaning of this discrepancy, the abstraction, the idealization of the peasant in Ottoman and Turkish historiography, putting the Armenian peasant in the center of the question, of this discussion. In this paper, our main aim is to ask some simple yet unanswered questions and clarify the main concepts of our study. So, okay. Our preliminary inquiry has initially shown that Turkish historiography has been employed to conceal the centrality of the Armenian peasantry by robbing the term denoting them of specificity, subjectivity, and agency as producers in a principally agrarian economy. Like Edgar Allan Poe's Purloined Letter, which is in sight before the protagonist, the Armenian peasant remains unseen. We will start with the Ottoman historiography as it provides a certain framework and a basis for Turkish historiography that was established in the 1940s. One of the major works on Ottoman peasantry is the edited volume published by Süreyya Farukhi and Halil Berktay in 1992, the New Approaches to State and Peasant in the Ottoman Empire. In his long and well-known essay, The Search for the Peasant in the Western and Turkish Historiography, Halil Berktay took issue with Western historiography more than the history of the Ottoman Empire and Turkey. Nonetheless, Berktay referred repeatedly to peasantry in Ottoman Empire as the Realia. So here, Realia is the protected and shepherded flock. Realia, the subject peasants attached to the soil. The Realia, tax-paying subjects, specifically peasantry. Realia are permanent and hereditary tenants attached to the soil. So similar definitions can be found in almost all English literature, English language literature on the subject of peasantry, primarily based on the studies done by Ömer Lütfü Barkan or Halil İnalcık. Paul Stirling, who has anthropological surveys on the Turkish village, draws attention to the fact that Turkish words used for peasant, köylü or çiftçi, do not have the same meaning that peasant has in English. Indeed, köylü means villager, while çiftçi today means farmer, and neither are a bureaucratic nor an administrative unit. The reason for this absence of an exact term in this is the extinction of the corresponding category, the Realia, in the Turkish Republic. In 1992, Berktay was complaining that even the term Realia was not defined in the Encyclopedia of Islam in Turkish, a deficiency which was addressed in 2007 with the addition of a long entry in the aforementioned source. According to both this entry and Mehmet Zeki Pakalın's dictionary published in 1954, Realia originally comprised the Muslim and non-Muslim flock alike. An area of study which, in my opinion, needs more elaboration, but increasingly, and especially in the 19th century, it denoted the non-Muslim taxpayers of the empire. Berktay chose not to include these above-mentioned definitions of Realia, but instead stated that the peasant in the Ottoman Empire was Realia. Following his argument, we can conclude that if the peasants in the Ottoman Empire were the Realia and Realia were the non-Muslims in the 19th century, peasants were the non-Muslims. In order to see whether this presumption holds true, I checked the online databases of the Ottoman archives. So in the Ottoman archives, we have basically two types of Realia registers. One doesn't specify the religion and says Realia defterleri and Realia defteri of a certain area. And then we have Muslim Realia defteri. For instance, Realia register of Sivas province, Niksarkaza, Kaleiçi district, or Muslim Realia register of Bolu province, Sinop Sancak, Ayandon district. So here is one from Sivas province, Niksarkaza, Kaleiçi district, which is clearly Realia register stating that it's the Armenian millet living in the Kaleiçi district. So it means if the register uses only Realia, it's a non-Muslim. Okay, even the Catholics in Sivas, for instance, here you have, had a special Realia register which exclusively listed Catholic Armenians, including the village of Pırkınik. So what I'm trying to say is that in the 19th century, the archival documents are clearly specifying who is Muslim and who is non-Muslim in a way Realia used for the non-Muslim. Even this quite simple search clarifies the meaning of the concept in the 19th century. Consequently, if Realia means the non-Muslim taxpayer attached to the soil in Berktay's definition, the peasant was mainly comprised of Armenians and Greeks, followed by Assyrians, Syriacs, and Chaldeans. So, by relativizing and blurring the meaning of Realia, Berktay creates an absolute abstraction, which hides the identity of the majority of the peasants. Though he criticizes the absence of the peasant or village life in Turkey's historiography, no historian of Turkey in 1990s would have dared to have written about the Christian peasant population, especially of the 19th century eastern provinces. There are many issues that in Berktay's article to criticize. However, the most striking is its purposeful and professional exclusion of the peasant from his search for the peasant in the Turkish historiography. Fikret Adaner follows a similar path in his 1998 article on Ottoman peasantry from 14th century to 1860s. While various taxation and land policies were listed throughout the article, mainly based on the existing secondary literature, that data was almost exclusively given from either the Balkans or from Syria and Palestine. Excluding the territories of today's Turkey is another way to exclude or to make the continuities between the Ottoman Empire and Turkey invisible. Indeed, attempting to write a 500-year history of peasantry up to Tanzimat, as ambitious as it is, could only be done by abstractions. This confirms our argument that the peasantry in the established Ottoman and Turkish historiography is a concept which excludes the actual people. So in order to make an interruption to that abstraction, here is a document sent by the Armenian peasants from Çorkmarzvan. But before that, I want to mention one more point. Not only do the Christian and Jewish peasant of Asia Minor and northern Mesopotamia become invisible in this abstraction, but so does the Turkish peasant, who, while seemingly being at the center of the literature, becomes completely amorphous. One paragraph from a petition sent by the Armenian villagers of Çorkmarzvan, today's Dörtyol, in Cilicia, written on the 1st of September 1868 to the Armenian Patriarchate in Istanbul, explaining the tortures they endured as a result of the exile and forced settlement of Armenians in Çorkmarzvan, from Çokmarzvan to Payas helps us break down this wall of abstraction. And here's what they're saying. This is an Armeno-Turkish document. I have the Turkish transcription and also the English translation that you can read. Saying that, and I quote, saying that the houses that ought to leave Payas will leave today by beating up, by cursing us. They are forcefully migrating us. From evening to the morning, without our consent, the Zaptias are beating us up. They feed their horses with bulgur instead of barley. They take our food as if it was theirs. The slander and the torture we have been going through has never had taken place before. They would eat one chicken, but they would kill 3 of them. End of quote. The voices of Armenian peasants from Çokmarzvan, or those of millions of others living in the provinces, were systematically avoided, ignored, or denied by the scholars in order to make the millions of Christian and Armenian peasants invisible. The abstraction continues into the historiography of Turkish Republic. Reading the Ottoman Historiography and the Turkish history written about the first decades of the Republic, it isn't possible to establish a connection between the annihilated Realia and the new köylü in the literature. Having been made as amorphous as possible, köylü in the Republic is a subject who has to be controlled at any rate. The village as an administrative unit and the villager, imagined by the ruling elites as illiterate, uneducated, backward inhabitant, was considered to be a problem. Various legal mechanisms such as settlement law or the land distribution law, as well as administrative and educational institutions such as village institutes, köy enstitüleri, the ruling party's CHP's people's houses, halk evleri, interestingly, all had a common thread which was related to redistribution of the land, as well as establishing representatives of the centralized state in the rural areas. Asım Karaömerlioğlu, in his article on the land distribution law, draws our attention to the fact that the law was mainly a political and ideological decision rather than an economic one. Further, he underlined the fact that the basic questions, such as how many of the farmers actually possessed land, remain unknown to scholars. We may also add the question, whose lands were redistributed? As Turkish governments prefer to keep the Armenian population in Turkey a secret even today, we have to count on the information gathered by the Armenian administration and published in various periodicals, especially in the yearbooks of Armenian Hospital, which constitutes the second most important institution of the Armenian administration after the Patriarchate. According to the magazine published by Mardiros Kochunian and Toros Azadyan in 1938, Arman, the gift, there were some 20,000 Armenians living in the provinces. Here you have a breakdown from the cities that I will be reading. The magazine was published as a gift on the occasion of 15th anniversary of the foundation of the Turkish Republic, and its Turkish translation, abridged to 7 pages, was sent to the then Prime Minister Celal Bayar. We can assume that the actual number of Armenians living in the provinces was much higher than 20,000 given. According to this source, Sivas had 1,000 Armenians, of which 25% were peasants and unskilled workers. Tokat had 900 Armenians, mostly peasants, such as wine growers, shepherds, millers, and roofers. Amasya had 800 Armenians, 40% of them peasants. Diyarbakir contained 1,000 Armenians, most of them peasants. 600 Armenians were listed in Konya with 40% of peasants. Yozgat, 1,200 Armenians, 80% peasants. And in Adana, Mersin, all 30 Armenians were peasants. While we have detailed demographic information on the Armenian male and female population and their occupation based on the data gathered by the Armenian administration, similar information on Turkish peasantry doesn't seem to be accessible or available. However, an interesting study, or perhaps better called an intelligence report, was conducted and published in 1966 about Turkey's showcase Armenian village, Vaccafleur. It was a joint study by Istanbul University's Sociology Department and Istanbul Technical University's Faculty of Architecture. The first sentence of the introduction stated that these monographs are of crucial importance in order to, and I quote, solve the problem of the village, which has been heatedly debated recently and regarded as central for the development of the society as a whole, end of quote. 209 pages in total. The book starts with the details of the location of the village, followed by a brief political history, male and female mortality rates, and demographic data according to the censuses conducted between 1945 to 60 was provided, 56 families, 66 houses, 291 inhabitants. The village was under French mandate until 1937, when it was annexed by Turkey, along with the entire Alexandret Sancak. The study stated that all villagers were peasants. So we have 291, so they were all peasants. While total land of the village amounted to 696 acres, only 85 acres belonged to the villagers. 422 acres instead were divided between different state institutions such as Treasury, Hazine, the General Directorate of Pious Foundations, FKAF, and the General Directorate of National Estate, Milli Emlak. Hence, 8.4% belonged to the villagers and 53% to the General Directorate of Pious Foundations. It can be speculated that the situation was similar in many villages where Armenians and Greeks used to live. The debate on the land redistribution or land reform in general in Turkey has to be contextualized with the confiscation of land and its nature. Considerable architectural details of the houses are included, along with professional architectural plans of the houses, the square meters of each room, the angle of sun, who was entitled to sleep and live where, and so on, can be found in the book. In the absence of surveillance technologies in the mid-1960s, this study must have served as a technical tool to spy on the villagers. However, it doesn't finish there. The families are listed with their names, including fathers' names, how much real estate they have, whether they were owned or rented, the size of the land they possessed, how many rooms per person they had in their houses, their level of education, and much more absolutely private information were all listed and turned into statistics without anonymizing their names. 3 sample families of low, middle, and high income were contained in the book, including their names and very detailed family histories. Without anonymizing the data, the researchers completely subjugated the village to their research methodology, turning them into the targets for the rest of the society. The book mentioned, although without context, banditry and village raids as a reason for fear and disgust among the villagers. Here's another house plan, yeah. So indeed, house and village raids had never stopped for Armenian villagers remaining in the provinces. I.A., born in Kubin in 1957, today Batman, previously under the authority of Siirt, reported the experience of his family after the land distribution law in 1950s. According to his statement, the village had demanded half of the land as a bribe in order to register the land in the name of I.A.'s family. In April 2019, when I conducted the oral history with AI, he told me that his family still owns this land in the village, together with the man who was the village head at that time, which continues to create endless troubles for I.A.'s family. According to I.A., up to the 1980s, there were thousands of Armenians in the villages of Batman and Siirt. After the murder of an Armenian man in the village by Kurdish gunmen in June 1966, all Armenian villagers decided to leave the village together in one night, seeking refuge in the buildings next to the Patriarchate in Istanbul. The lack of factual data in Ottoman historiography on peasantry and the complete abstraction of Turkish village during the first decades of the Republic is a remarkable and yet unquestioned continuity. Indeed, the fact that there isn't even a single book studying the meaning, explaining the meaning of Realia throughout the Ottoman history from 15th century to the 20th is very telling. While Realia remains an abstraction, by not studying the changing meaning of the concept over centuries and using it to create new abstractions, such as the peasant, amounts to epistemic violence, making the subject of the concept completely invisible and incomprehensible. As opposed to the abstracted peasant of Ottoman and Turkish historiography, the book on Vaccafleur, exposing all the private details of the Armenian families, shows the state's proficiency of data gathering. Hence, we can assume that much more data exists that has not been made available. The percentage of the land that belonged to the local Christian peasants during the Republic may well be very similar to Vaccafleur, meaning that in the many villages, the lands of Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians must have been confiscated by various state institutions, while the remaining Christians became landless. The land distribution law in practice, as in the case of IA's family from Kubin Batman, shows the line of continuity between banditry and legalized land confiscation. Consequently, the bigger picture should include the fact that the land confiscations, which began in the mid-19th century, never ceased. Therefore, the abstraction of peasant was a way to skirt around an issue of national security, while at the same time, it was central to creating mainstream historiography that could never be questioned in the absence of official data. A win-win situation for both the state and scholars, where the loser remains the same, as always, the Armenian and peasant. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Suciyan. Very illuminating on this question of land ownership and especially on the Rea. So that is certainly an area that's going to need more research. So we'd like to make sure that that's going to be talked about. I want to remind everyone that at the conclusion of the three speakers, we'll have an opportunity to ask questions and hold a discussion using the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. Thank you again, Dr. Suciyan. Our second speaker is Dr. Umit Kurt. Dr. Kurt received his doctorate from the Department of History at Clark University in 2016. The topic of his dissertation was the destruction of Aintab Armenians and emergence of the new wealthy class, plunder of Armenian wealth, 1890s to 1920s. He is currently working as a Polonsky Fellow at the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem. He is the author of The Great Hopeless Turkish Race, Fundamentals of Turkish Nationalism in the Turkish Homeland, 1911 to 1916. And also he is the author with Taner Akcan of The Spirit of the Laws, the Plunder of Wealth in the Armenian Genocide. He is going to be speaking today about the history of a local Republican entrepreneur in New Turkey, Cemil Alevli. So we'd like to welcome Dr. Kurt and welcome, and you can begin your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you all. Hello. I would like to thank Professor Barlow of Mugrdechian for organizing this great conference with me again, and for and other participants' invaluable contribution as well. And also I would like to thank Armenian Studies program at Fresno State University, California, for making this event happen. Today, I would like to talk about one of my new research projects, which is about Cemil Alevli, a famous entrepreneur and capitalist, and then leading urban bourgeois, member of urban bourgeoisie in Gaziantep during the Republican era. In my previous work, I extensively elucidated and focused on the active and direct involvement of local elites or the Aintab gentry in the destruction of their Armenian neighbors and confiscation, liquidation, plunder of their wealth and properties in 1915 and 1918. I try to reveal and unfold the transfer of this huge wealth from Armenian to Muslim hands, and from 1915 all the way leading up to 30s and 40s in the Republican era. So in order to understand Cemil Alevli, who came out of this juncture, I would like to give a historical and political context, the way in which Cemil Alevli emerged and transpired himself. After all, we are talking about a Republican elite, an economic elite who was brought in and invested to become a proper and full-fledged entrepreneur whose major objective would contribute to the economic development of his own city as an ideal Republican citizen. This idea of development, idea of civilization, they were main and fundamental tenets of the new republic in accordance with the Kemalist modernization, all these progressive modernizing, moving forward ideas and so forth, which was pretty much affected by the French Revolution and the French Enlightenment. So in doing so, Alevli and his allikes, he will also make contribution to the advancement of his country. So he was as I said, he was a Republican elite and the Republican one, and the raising ideal entrepreneur, just like himself, it fits to the idea of creation of capitalist and entrepreneur for capital accumulation in New Turkey. As a matter of fact, this idea, was first formed and installed by the CUP, Union and Progress Party, and then bequeathed and inherited and flourished by Mustafa Kemal and his rank and file. So this creation and formation of entrepreneurial and capitalist class was a necessity for the new nation state. The very first capital, of course, of this class, this constructed class, let's say, was based on the wealth of the Ottoman Christians, first and foremost Armenians and Greeks. So the existence of one class was hinged upon the absence of Ottoman Christian population and their material economic existence. The finance, movable and immovable properties and know-how of Ottoman Christians were taken away and appropriated by the CUP first, and then New Republic inherited this legacy, increased it, strengthened it, and consolidated it under the veils of laws. So what were those laws? Those laws were known as abundant property laws and regulations. In the literature, there has been a conventional tendency that these abundant properties laws were only the case and valid for the CUP era. Now, these laws and regulations were also inherited, reformed, revised, and used by the Republican elites and the New Republic, even all the way leading up to 1989. So in micro or local level, this process revealed itself with a lot of plunders and lootings by local elites and gentry, as well as ordinary civilians. But here, role of local elites became most manifest, at least in the case of Aintab in southern Turkey. So genocidal process may be put in motion at the center, but it's inevitably guided by locality. Any orders from above are subject to being accepted by which or rejected by local power brokers, the social and political actors. The relationship between the central and local power brokers is symbiotic. The central authorities need local actors to carry out their orders, while the local actors need the central authorities to legitimize their actions, in turn bolstering their social standing. Some families might be able to mobilize dozens of men on the streets to murder, rape, and pillage for the dirty works, while others might be in a position to organize hundreds, earning them great favor with the central authorities. This reciprocal power dynamic has proven to be effective in the commission of mass murder. The thirst of power, as well as the promise of material gain, is motivation enough to galvanize local actors to commit acts of genocide. The Ottoman district of Aintab in that sense, and then Gaziantep, in the present day Gaziantep, serves as a good example of how these dynamics produced the Armenian genocide at the local level. So following the destruction of Aintab Armenians, the promise of economic power drew active support for and the participation in the micro policy of the CUP, annihilation of all of Turkey's Armenians. More importantly, the property and material benefits acquired from the victims were important means of further binding the beneficiaries to each other and the CUP regime. So in order to fulfill its policy of destruction, CUP was required to make concessions. Therefore, one could argue that what motivated the urban Muslims of Aintab to join the CUP and take part in its genocidal policies was not solely a shared ideology, but also self-interest. This situation in turn greatly widened the scope of complicity, not just in the sense of more people being involved as perpetrator or beneficiaries after the genocide had been initiated, but also in the sense of more sections of society actually encouraging genocide in the first place. The post-First World War and the post-genocide Republican regime was closely linked to its CUP predecessor in that sense, in terms of its persecutory economic policy, personnel, and ideology. So the newly reached Gaziantep, notably Cemil Alevli Bey, not only became influential figures of national resistance during the Republican period, but some also emerged as the new captains of industry in the city. Excuse me. For their active participation in the war against the French, I'm talking about the Aintab War, Aintab İntabashnuşçun, or in Aintab defense, self-defense in the Turkish historiography, these elites were rewarded with abundant properties, which they acquired for a pittance. The perpetrators and their families profited from the genocide to the extent that after 1923, entire generations were educated and supported by the startup capital of Armenian property acquired in 1915 and 1918. In other words, the elimination of Armenians paved the way for the rise of a new ruling class in Gaziantep, and these elites, including Cemil Alevli, who is our protagonist today, in 50s and 60s, these elites became or transformed themselves into urban bourgeois from countryside bourgeoisie. Effects of this process can clearly be seen at the local level in the Ottoman periphery. Wealth and richness of local elites, provincial notables, and Muslim gentry were based on so-called legally confiscated and liquidated, as well as plundered Armenian properties. And this process was initiated and orchestrated by the CUP and accelerated by the new Republican regime through legal mechanisms and personal undertakings. So, creation of local capitalists and entrepreneurs was one of the major objectives of the new regime founded by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk in 1923. This objective was also in line with the decisions of Izmir Economic Congress, which was in favor of economic liberalism and formation of entrepreneurial class with the help of the state inducement. So Cemil Alevli, as the very first capitalist in the classical sense of the word, an entrepreneur of the city of Gaziantep, southern Anatolia, Cilicia region, was a product, an outcome of this long-lasting historical process and epitomized a Republican entrepreneur par excellence. So I would like to actually give you a quote, a depiction, about how his daughter, Nüket Alevli Ersoy, portrays his late father in his biography, which she has penned recently, and it has been published in Doğan Kitap in Turkey this year. This is the book. She portrays his father as the following, quote, "Every society, every city has lots of hidden heroes who affected the fate of them. These heroes are circulating on various subjects from language to language. Names to the fore often occurs. However, they do for the cities and countries where people live, they succeeded, artifacts they left behind, and sets an example for the next generation until their turn. Cemil Alevli was involved in the re-establishment and liberation from the enemy occupation of Gaziantep, the spiritual heritage he left behind at the end of his life, is a true lover of Gaziantep industry and the economy have created the foundation of Republic. So let's talk about his family background first. It says a lot about the way he made himself as he was and as he would be, actually. So Cemil Alevli was born in October 17, 1901 in Antep. His father was Mustafa Remzi Efendi from Aliveli family, and after the surname law promulgated in 1934, the family acquired the surname Alevli. So, but the incipient name was Aliveli. So Mustafa Remzi Efendi, and his mother was Beşezade Said İbrahim Ağa's daughter. She was Hatice Hanım. So what we are talking about is intra-elite family marriage. So his family was a part of Aintab gentry. His father, Mustafa Remzi Efendi, was a prominent local elite and provincial notable, was engaging with trade and commerce in the city. He was married to daughter of another well-known provincial notable, Said Beşezade. So these intra-elite marriages were the case then, as was the case in Armenian community too in the city, by the way. So it wasn't something unique or exclusive to Muslims. So this tradition carried on by the Republican regime and was also embraced among Republican elites in other localities too. So these kinds of marriages also provided families to keep the capital and the inheritance within the families themselves rather than giving them out to someone else. So, and also enable these families to increase their capital and eventually inheritance for the heirs and for the sustainability of these families for their posterity. So these family connections, and it pertained also these families tied with the establishment, the state, and equipped with privilege, having high education, certain economic concessions. They were state-supported families in various fields of life. They were city elites and so on and so forth. They were in the politics, they were in the economy, they were in social life and educational life and so forth. So Cemil Alevli, he went to Mahmudiye Elementary School, basically received a medrese education, religious education, pristine religious education, which was in Barlow neighborhood. And then he received his diploma by completing Numune Rüştiyesi, and Cemil Alevli providing training education at high school level, and then went to trade idadi. And in this idadi, his English teacher was Baron Mısırlıya, by the way. So a name change afterwards, Aynul education. So as I said, both Mustafa Remzi Efendi, his father, and the Said Beşe, his maternal grandfather, were leading members of the Aintab CUP club too. Aintab CUP club was founded immediately after of the Young Turk Revolution of July 1908, and in September 1908, the same Young Turk club was also founded in the city, and Mustafa Remzi and Said Beşe, they just jumped to the organization and became members immediately. But here, Ali Beşe, Cemil Alevli's uncle, is actually worth focusing on. So what did Ali Beşe do? So Ali Beşe was also another member and founding member, one of the founding members of the Aintab CUP club. Actually, he had very close knits with the central members of the Committee of Union and Progress, even in Istanbul. So he had really long arms. So it's important to talk about Ali Beşe and his activities, as well as his role in the life of Cemil Alevli. After all, Ali Beşe is significant, critical figure in the history of Aintab, later Gaziantep. He was a prominent local elite, important member of Aintab gentry, and as I said, fervent member of Aintab CP club, and played a pivotal role in deportation and liquidation of Armenians and their wealth and properties. He was the one who actually convinced central members of the CUP and the CUP and the henchmen of Talat Pasha to deport the Armenians in the city. So Ali Beşe was close to the CUP ruling government and its elites in Istanbul, as I said, as his influence continued in the post-war era and the Republican period. Mustafa Kemal and his Republican regime, New Republic, also trusted him. He was taking charge of helping new nation state, New Republic, to raise a group of entrepreneurs. But before that, he fulfilled exactly the same duty in 1915 and in 1918. In August 1915, when the deportation of Armenians from the city started off and carried on till the end of 1917, once nearly entire population of Armenian artisans were deported, meeting daily necessities of the city's Muslim population became extremely difficult. In order to resolve this serious problem and revitalize artisanship and economy in the city, in the face of absence of Armenians, obviously, a group of wealthy Muslims led by Ali Deshay founded a committee to bring up artisans by sending 12 young Muslims to Istanbul and had them work in state manufacturers and factories in Harem, Beykoz, Fesane, and so forth. So these 12 young guys would learn the various crafts and artisanship, then return to their town to perform these crafts, thereby contribute to the development of the city and its economy. Eventually, they would raise their own apprentices. This is really an interesting undertaking. So on the one hand, CUP and the state confiscates and liquidates, expropriates Armenian wealth, assets and properties through a series of laws and regulations, administrative mechanisms, as well as a lot of plunders and lootings in cooperating with local elites and provincial notables like Ali Deshay. On the other hand, there was kind of development to raise and cultivate artisans for the progress of the economy, and also filled a huge gap as a result of deporting Armenians and ruining their economic existence and capabilities. As you see, these two processes went hand in hand. So the same Ali Deshay did exactly the same job for New Republic. So we will get back to that point later, actually. And by the way, I would like to underline that I liken Ali Deshay's activities to Kara Kemal, who was the Minister of Procurement of the CUP and exactly fulfilled the same responsibility in Istanbul and in different parts of Anatolia, Kara Kemal, to create a national bourgeoisie. It was his main objective back then. So Cemil Alevli got interested in textile business and weaving, alaca in Turkish, weaving the thread. Alaca means weaving the thread in different colors. So he got interested in this business when he was 14, 15 years old. This interest was really profound and never got away from him in his young age. He was infatuated with this business, actually. He even realized in his 14 and 15 that there was a huge gap in weaving business in the field of weaving after Armenians were deported from the city. So he was aware of that situation and wanted to make use of it by learning this craft and business, wanted to make a career out of it by cultivating himself. So he was ready to what it took. First, in 1915, he started to work as apprentice for Mehmed Usta, who knew this craft. And then his father, one of the rare Muslims who actually had an expertise regarding this craft, Mehmed Usta. And then his father, Mustafa Remzi, Cemil Alevli's father, bought a few weaving looms for his son Cemil. But Cemil was not content with them because these looms did only weave one straight color. Then deportation came to his rescue. Sarkisus from Maraş was deported to Aintab. Back then, Armenians of Maraş, by the way, was first sent to Antep, stayed there for a while, and then exiled to Syria. So Aintab was kind of a transit camp until the first deportation of Aintab Armenians were initiated in August 1915. So Aintab was used by the CUP as a transit camp until August 1915. So Sarkisus was one of those Armenians from Maraş, Elbistan. He was an expert on weaving and had an expertise on the jacquard machine. Jacquard machine, actually, it was the machine which was, the impeccable machine for producing that kind of product. So this jacquard machine, he also had an expertise which enabled someone to weave in various colors and patterns. Cemil Alevli met him, learned how to weave with jacquard machine from Sarkis, and then allegedly speaking, he purchased a few jacquard machines from deportees and eventually started to run his own weaving looms. we don't have any kind of information about his role in the Armenian deportation in the city because he was like 14 or 15 years old at the time. He was in 1920 and 21, during the Aintab War, he was a member of militia group defending Balıklı Çukurbostan neighborhood. He was responsible for transporting the children and women in the city to Textile village and protection of them until the war was over. So all Armenians left, all artisans gone, Aintab economy totally collapsed, on the verge of collapsing. Once Armenians left, there was this big gap in the field of economy, in various fields of economy. So Alevli want to capitalize on this situation and fill this huge gap. Here again, Ali Beshe comes into the picture. What he did? He actively involved in the Aintab War between 1921 to 2021, had close ties with Mustafa Kemal, Turu Kılıç Ali, by the way. He was a close friend of Kılıç Ali, who was amongst Mustafa Kemal's entourage. He chose, Ali Beshe chose again 5 young men this time to send Germany for training and making them gifted entrepreneur and became capitalists eventually. This was the project having the objective of creating national economy and its businessmen, making them acquire well education and training in Europe. It was necessary for revitalization of Aintab economy and trade, particularly aftermath of the total forced departures of Aintab Armenians, because they were main engine of the city's economy. So the idea that industrialization is a driving force in the city's development was adopted in that year, but there was no state support, not adequate state support and skilled manpower. So Ali Beshe fulfilled this responsibility for the revitalization of the city. So Cemil Alevli was one of these 5 young men. In 1922, at a ceremony held in front of the high school in Gaziantep, farewell to Germany. After a long and tiring journey, Alevli and his friends reached Germany. Cemil Alevli first solved the language problem and then in a very short period of time, and began to learn textile education. He was quite successful actually on that in the school, and he finished it with distinction. Once he returned to Gaziantep, he was asked to draw a plan of textile factory by Sümerbank, a state-supported bank, state-funded bank. In 1926, Sümerbank wanted to found a textile factory in the city. Plans and projects of the foundation of the factory were prepared as a result of long and meticulous research conducted by Cemil Alevli, but this attempt was stopped by the new economy minister at the time. According to his daughter, the industrialization of the city was his biggest dream. So since his childhood, his biggest idea to found a textile factory in Antep, it was like became a reason to live for him. So once he returned to Antep from Germany, he was involved in various economic undertakings. So until the establishment of his own textile factory, in other words, he was engaged with various businesses, such as automotive spare parts, various food products, the modernization of agricultural activities, marketing and distribution of petroleum and petroleum products in Gaziantep. He acquired foreign representatives of these kind of businesses. And these works were considered as a great service to the development of modern business approach in the city, actually. And finally, in 1932, he made his dream real. The buildings of Atenagan, Armenian boys' school, and the Second Catholic Church, along with an Armenian house, which belonged to Suciyan family, were passed over to the national estate, Milli Emlak, after Armenians had to vacate the city between 1912 and 1922. These buildings have been later turned into village, thread, and weaving factory and given to Cemil Alevli by a special order of Mustafa Kemal in order to create a class of entrepreneurs and capitalists in Aintab. This is exactly was the document saying this in Republican archives I happened to find. So his factory was erected on these Armenian buildings: Catholic Church, House of Kalusyan family, and Atenegan School. So Alevli also benefited from Teşvik-i Sanayi Kanunu, law for industry inducement in English translation, which was promulgated in 1927 as well, and financially supported by the state. So he brought all machines and other equipment for installation of the system in factory from Germany, brought German experts to install the machines, employed numerous people and trained them by means of German masters. From 1932 through 1950s, Village thread and weaving factory, Leer Forward, exceeded its production capacity, greatly exported products, and it became a trademark in Gaziantep and all southern Turkey. Alevli dominated textile business in the region and grown up the factory. As a result, his fortune skyrocketed. So at this point, I would like to tell you a very interesting anecdote about Alevli, which took place in 1957. He encountered the owner of the house, the Kalusyan family, member of the Kalusyan family, owner of the house. How? In 1957, he stays in Park Hotel in Istanbul, the fanciest hotel of the time in Istanbul, and receives a message that an American who stays in the same hotel wants to meet him. This person sees Cemil Alevli's Cadillac. By the way, it was the first Cadillac in Gaziantep then. And from the license plate, he figures this car is from Antep. It turns out that this American was an Armenian from Antep, a member of Kalusyan family, who was one of the prominent and wealthy Armenian families in the city before the war. He was with his wife, who was a member of another prominent Armenian family, Nazaretya. Again, another intra-elite family marriage. She was the granddaughter of famous Kara Nazara. And interestingly enough, so Kalusyan family was in the textile business in Aintab, and they objected to establish a textile factory in the city before the war. Apparently, it came to naught because of deportation and the war. So this Armenian couple from USA visiting Istanbul at that time met with Cemil Alevli. They tell him that they also visited their houses in Antep. For instance, Alevli himself reveals that the inn, houses, and soap factory, which belonged to Nazaretyan family, were transferred to Mahmud Dai and his heirs in 1957. As for Kalusyan house, Cemil Alevli's Velish thread factory was built in its space, as I have just pointed out. So Cemil Alevli did literally meet the real owner of his factory in 1957 and unfolded this story in his memoir without any hesitation. This is tea, by the way, not whiskey. So Gaziantep's first modern and integrated facility, Village Weaving Factory. So it was also a major source of inspiration to other people and organization in a few years. So this plant was a grown of qualified staff, especially employment was of unemployed came to the city with migration and found a job in this factory, and so on and so forth. So the factory renewed itself with technology over time and to produce the qualitative products, and it was ranked among the most the respected companies of Turkey, and so forth. So, of course, these economic privileges, this economic wealth brought political representation together. So he was involved in politics too. So as a leading capitalist and successful entrepreneur of the city, he drew CHP's attention. So Republican People's Party. In 1941, Republican People's Party asked him to become deputy of the city, but he was not eager to do so. But not resisting the pressures and insistences, he accepted to become first the president of the CHP's Gaziantep branch in 1941. Eventually, he got the seat in the parliament and stood for Gaziantep as a deputy for the term of 1946 and 1950. Interestingly enough, I read all of his speeches in the parliament, and these speeches generally focus on rights of workers, maintaining their overtime rights, alleviating their working conditions, as well as providing them health care. That was his main concern. He kept he kept, making all these points again and again in the parliament when he took the stage. So, of course, as an entrepreneur and a Republican entrepreneur, Republican capitalist, he also, he brought a lot of services to the state, to the city, because this serving the city means serving the nation for him in his enlightened mind. So, and he was the one who realized the first, realized the airport project in the city in 1943. He ensured the completion of Gaziantep airport, and then railroad transports and airport and so forth. He really gave intense struggle for government investment to be brought to Gaziantep. So, and this serving the nation is tantamount to serving the state, to creating an ideal young under the banner of Atatürk and his modern civilization, raising enlightened individual. Education, of course, is vital for him. So he was like, he scholastically believed in education. So this part is actually related to my own personal history as well. It's the beauty of history as a discipline for a historian, actually, to see the impact, effects, and repercussions of the history of your object of inquiry on your own personal history. Because I both attended the primary school he founded and the high school, again, he established. And he invested a great deal in education, founded schools, raised a lot of children, and send them to send them abroad for education, and so on and so forth. So he gave huge importance of education. So, which was actually in accordance with the long-lasting tenet and feature of the Republican idea, the Kemalist idea, Kemalist secularist idea. So to conclude, his again daughter in his biography, she set the tone as follows, and when she again gives credit to his father, quote, "He never evaded tax. Always an industrious entrepreneur, an impeccable representative of Turkish youngster in the ideal of Atatürk." Okay, he always paid the tax, but his incipient capital, initial source of his huge wealth and fortune was based on the properties of deported Armenians. So Alevli envies advancement of Armenian society in trade, finance, and especially education. He never hesitates to express his feelings about this, by the way. He was very candid in that sense, saying the capital, money-making jobs were at the hands of Armenians before the World War I. So in the recent book, again, his biography is penned by his daughter, as I said, Nüket Alevli Ersoy writes, without taking any penny from anyone, he spearheaded the textile industry by establishing first thread factory solely with the help of his own great effort in Gaziantep. But in the war's aftermath, actually, in Aintab War, there is this town crier. He walks around town, calling those who had participated in the Aintab War in 1920-21 to come down to Tuzhane, Salt Inn in Antep. Many, including Cemil Alevli's dad, head over. A guy tells them, queue up in twos. They will let people in two at a time. Then line comes to Cemil Alevli's father, Mustafa Remzi Bey Efendi. He sees these keys placed on a rock. Each person takes two, says the guy in charge. There are also these medallions on the rock. And Mustafa Remzi Efendi takes a look and says, so that's what we save Aintab for? 2 keys and a piece of tin. Thanks. He leaves. Who would have known that those keys belong to the Armenians? Those 2 keys were the keys to 2 Armenian houses. So this guy's son, Cemil Alevli, he witnessed city's economic, political, and cultural improvement, personally contributed to this development. As a literate resident of Aintab, received a good education abroad, and who had a Western worldview, and significant representative of the rural bourgeoisie in the city, and which play an active role in Eintop's primitive capital accumulation. Doubtlessly, behind this primitive accumulation lies the movable and immovable properties of Armenians who left Eintop as a whole in 1920-22. In fact, this is a process that started in 1895, speeded up with the definite departure of Armenians in 1915 and 1921. Alevli, who was a prominent representative of Gaziantep local bourgeoisie, was a product of this process, later becoming the biggest textile supplier of Gaziantep in the Republic of Turkey. And he admits that he learned the business from Eintop Armenians. Quote, "Since my childhood, I used to watch how Armenians in my neighborhood work on their textile looms for hours and hours as I head back and forth to school. I was amazed to follow how Armenian weavers created beautiful fabrics by combining various tones of red, yellow, green, blue, and thread codes." So his life story of how he became an entrepreneur, made his wealth, and consolidated his class position is important to grasp for and to understand the foundational tenets of early republic, new nation state, and its economic policies. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kurt, for your presentation on a very interesting sort of example of your whole point that you were trying to make about the role of the merchants who made basically their money off of the Armenians. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Ari Şekeryan. He graduated from the Department of Oriental Studies at the University of Oxford and defended his dissertation entitled "The Armenians in the Ottoman Empire After the First World War, 1918 to 1923, which analyzes the transformation of the Ottoman Armenian political stance and the impacts of social and political developments of the period on the post-genocide Armenian community by examining the Ottoman, Turkish, and Armenian press. He is currently a Munich postdoctoral fellow at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and he was also a Kazan visiting professor in Armenian studies at Fresno State in the spring of 2020. His talk will be on the loyal citizens of the Republic, the Armenian community during the first years of the Republic of Turkey, 1923 to 1928. Dr. Şekeryan.
Right. Hi, everyone. Let me share my presentation very quickly. There we go. First of all, I want to thank Professor Barlow, Mugrdechian, and Dr. Umit Kurt for organizing this conference and for giving the opportunity to present my research on the early Republican years. Today, I will present some preliminary research results, as I am still in the process of reading Turkish and Armenian newspapers, parliamentary minutes, and archival documents for the early Republican years. I will present some examples from the primary sources, mainly from the Turkish and Armenian press in this case, because I'm still in the process of developing my arguments and in the process of thinking how I can attach my arguments, link my arguments to the secondary literature and historiography that already established by Talin, Suciyan, and Leer Ekmekçioğlu. Following the proclamation of the Turkish Republic in 1923 and the signing of the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, the Armenian community centered in Istanbul took initiatives to build relations with the newly established nationalist government in Ankara. So the community members and leadership were tired of never-ending wars, which started in 1912 in the Balkans and came to an end in Western Anatolia in 1922. Obviously, the Armenian community had gone through significant changes during these 10 years. The Armenian intellectuals, most importantly, who created a vibrant intellectual environment in Istanbul and who were the locomotives of the community's social and political and cultural life, were mostly lost their lives during the wartime and genocide. Thousands of refugees and orphans found shelter in Syria, Lebanon, and Greece, and many Armenians in Istanbul left for Europe and the United States following the defeat of the Greek forces in Western Anatolia in 1922. Feeling isolated and betrayed, actually, by the policies of the Allied powers, the community members who continued to stay in Istanbul found no other alternative but to establish connections with the nationalist leaders and integrate into the Turkish society. To facilitate the process of this accommodation of state policies as a non-dominant ethnic group in Istanbul, a group within the Armenian community, led by the Armenian businessmen, especially, forced the Armenian Patriarch Bishop Zaven to resign from his position in 1922. The first target of this group was Patriarch Zaven because the leadership of the Turkish national movement in Ankara saw Patriarch Zaven, saw him as a traitor and an obstacle for the re-establishment of Turkish-Armenian relations. So that's why their first target was Bishop Zaven. Soon, Bishop Zaven left Istanbul without official resignation, and Bishop Aslanyan, who had better relations with the state officials, was elected as patriarchal locum tenens. Those Armenians who strongly supported the idea of establishing friendly relations with the Turkish national movement organized around the Turkish-Armenian Ascent Association, Türk-Ermeni Teali Cemiyeti. The association members held meetings with the Turkish intellectuals in Istanbul regularly and visited Ankara to hold meetings with the state officials. The removal of Bishop Zaven from his position and the establishment of this Turkish-Armenian Ascent Association were two important steps taken by this group of Armenian individuals who were ready to accommodate nationalist state policies for the sake of protecting the community's life, physical, cultural, and social life in Istanbul. This integration, however, came with a prerequisite. From the very first days of the newly established republic, the non-Muslim populations, such as Greeks, Armenians, and Jews, were under pressure of the state policies. While transforming from a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire to a nation state, these population groups were the most vulnerable ones. As a result, the Armenian community found itself in a state of a continuous state of loyalty verification process run by the state officials and Turkish intellectuals in Istanbul. During this quote-unquote loyalty verification process, the Armenian community leadership in Istanbul felt obligated to make public statements at each time when the Turkish press published provocative news which targeted the Armenian population in Istanbul. In this presentation, I will demonstrate how the nationalist policies of newly established republic and the publications of Turkish press in Istanbul affected the social life of Armenian community by discussing two specific policies of the state. First, the use of Turkish language at Armenian schools, and the second, the nationalist propaganda in the Turkish press and how it affected the collective psychology of the Armenian community in Istanbul. One of the primary aims of the newly established Turkish state was to increase the use of Turkish language in every region of the country, particularly in Istanbul, where approximately half of the population consisted of Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and foreigners who preferred communication naturally in their native languages. In order to reach this goal, the first target of the nationalist cadre in Ankara was the non-Turkish schools in Istanbul. The government issued a circular as early as in 1924 and started to assign teachers of Turkish language, history, and geography courses for non-Turkish schools. Interestingly, the salaries of these teachers would be paid by the schools themselves. No state support would be provided. Failing to pay the salaries of Turkish language, history, and geography teachers would result in complete shutdown of these schools. Those non-Turkish schools who failed to pay the salaries of Turkish teachers would be closed down permanently. This rule was the first step of a repressive policy which put on the shoulders of the school administrations, because many of them were not even able to pay the salaries of already existing teaching staff. For example, the budgets of the Armenian schools were dependent on the religious foundations, which were putting tremendous efforts to cover the needs of the Armenian refugees who were sheltered in the stations established in the churchyards in Istanbul. The budgets of these foundations were not enough to cover the salaries of the teaching staff, and paying the salaries of the Turkish teachers was beyond the bounds of possibility for these schools. The situation was the same in the Greek schools, Orthodox Rumi schools in Istanbul. Those schools who failed to pay salaries of Turkish teachers were closed down. The inspectors appointed by the state visited schools routinely to search for quote-unquote dangerous maps, posters, and textbooks. The directors were not allowed to observe the courses taught by the Turkish teachers. And while Greek teachers were not receiving their salaries for months, the schools were trying hard to cover salaries of Turkish teachers. Both Greek and Armenian school directors complained that some of the Turkish teachers didn't even have the necessary teaching certification and lacked knowledge in the Turkish language, history, and geography. More importantly, the minimum salary scale, which was decided by the government for the Turkish teachers teaching at these schools, were approximately 4 times higher than the salaries of Armenian and Greek teachers. In one Armenian school, 2 of the Turkish teachers' salaries were equal to the total salaries of the other teaching staff. If you think that the government had knowledge about the salaries of teaching staff at these schools, we could reach the possibility that the government willfully put tremendous financial burdens on the shoulders of these schools. The schools were under close surveillance, with inspectors assigned by the Directorate of Education visiting schools regularly, searching for dangerous maps and books, and ordering removal of religious objects from the walls, meeting with the Turkish teachers to discuss the implementation of a planned agenda. For example, clothing of the students at these schools were also under close scrutiny. The Director of Education Istanbul sent a circular to the French schools that the hats, which had red, white, and blue colors representing the French flag, would be banned. The Armenian students who were wearing hats with red, blue, and orange colors, and the Greek students who had white and blue colored hats were also informed that these hats were permanently banned in these schools. School ceremonies were also under surveillance by the inspectors to check if the national holidays were being celebrated by the students enthusiastically or not. Together with the agenda of Turkish language instruction in non-Turkish schools to increase quote-unquote Turkishness of young generations, the use of Turkish in public space was also a concern for the nationalist authorities in Ankara. It was decided that all the public gatherings, ceremonies, celebrations would be conducted in Turkish language. Only the use of French was allowed as a second language. The use of any other language was strictly forbidden. After the armistice period and the proclamation of the Republic in 1923, suspicion was the main characteristics of the attitude of the Turkish society and state towards the non-Muslim populations. Both the nationalist cadre in Ankara and the Turkish intellectuals writing for the dailies in Istanbul approached the non-Muslim groups with suspicion. Complete loyalty to eliminate that suspicion was a prerequisite for continuing living in peace in Turkey. I argue that with the agitating publications of the Turkish press and nationalist policies introduced by the state, the Armenian community found itself in a mood of continuous anxiety in which they were supposed to prove the Turkish society and state that they were actually the loyal citizens of the Republic. In this part of my presentation, I will present examples from the Turkish press and the reactions of the Armenian community against these agitating publications. The first thing that we need to consider is the travel ban that was issued by the government. According to this travel ban, the Armenians living in Istanbul were not allowed to travel outside of the city. Similarly, those Armenians who wanted to travel to Istanbul from Anatolia were not allowed. The primary aim of this travel ban was to control and surveil the Armenian population, force them not to return to their native towns and villages in Anatolia, and not to claim their properties. Perhaps this was the most important one, to force them not to claim their properties in Anatolia. Travel ban on the Armenian community was strictly followed by the law enforcement officers. For example, there are reports that Armenian merchants who traveled from Çatalca to Istanbul were not allowed to go back to their villages. Similarly, for example, an Armenian merchant who traveled from Edirne to Istanbul for business purposes was not allowed to return Edirne for 3 months. With the increasing number of publications appeared in the Turkish press targeting the non-Muslim populations, the Armenian community leadership took some initiatives in order to ease this anxiety and stress among the community members. As a first step, the Armenian community leadership decided to take steps to renounce the rights given by the Treaty of Lausanne's Article 42, especially the first clause which was related with the family law, since the talks were being made among the nationalist authorities that the state would accept the civil code. The Armenian community leadership thought that the rights related to family law would lose its meaning once the Turkish state started to implement the civil code, the civil code of Switzerland. So even though the Armenian community took steps to renounce their rights related to the family law, the Turkish press and intellectuals continued its hostile publications. Tevhid urged Tevhid, a Turkish daily published in Istanbul, urged the Turkish society to be cautious and suspicious when it comes to the Armenians, as believing the Armenians would bring a destruction of the state's unity. Süleyman Nazif, for example, a famed Turkish intellectual who was writing for the Son Telegraph Daily, further targeted the Armenians, claiming that it was impossible for a Turk to forget the attitudes of Armenians during the armistice period. He concluded by endorsing the policies of the Committee of Union and Progress. I quote, "After the armistice years, I understand that there was no other direction than the one which was taken by Talat Pasha. Because of this, I beg pardon from his soil and memory." So the Turkish press played a major role in the escalation of hatred within the Turkish society through its publications targeting the non-Muslim populations. In this section, I will provide episodes of news published in Turkish press, demonstrate how these publications further increased the collective anxiety among the members of Armenian community and forced them to repeatedly present their quote-unquote loyalty to the state. In October 1924, the Turkish newspapers in Istanbul started a series of publications regarding an unverified assassination attempt. According to this alleged news, the Armenian Komitacıs organized an assassination operation to murder Mustafa Kemal Pasha, the president of Turkey, and other prominent figures of the Turkish national movement. Even though the news were not verified by the authorities, the Turkish dailies use the news of this assassination attempt to further target the Armenians and increase the sentiments of hatred among the Turkish society. Vakit published a list of former assassinations that were organized by the ARF, Armenian Revolution Federation, such as the murders of Talat Pasha, Said Halim, Cemal Azmi, Bahattin Shakir, and Cemal Pasha, and urged the society to be cautious about, quote-unquote, the Armenian threat. Vakit's concluding remarks are critical for our discussion. I quote, "We wonder if the Armenians living in abroad take into consideration that what fatal consequences the activities of these revolutionaries might have on the Armenians living in Turkey. You cannot find a person in Turkey who accepts these murders towards the Turkish state leaders as simple acts. You will see reprehensible action which could be disastrous for the Armenians living in Turkey." End quote. Vakit's concluding sentence carries significance in the sense that it openly threatened the Armenians living in Turkey by telling that, quote-unquote, reprehensible actions of the Armenian committees might result in disastrous steps taken by the Turks against the Armenians living in Turkey. Naturally, there was a chaos among the Armenian community in Istanbul caused by these publications. As part of the investigations, Armenian individuals without having any political affiliation were getting arrested on the streets of Istanbul by the police. In Kumkapı, for example, an Armenian man, Zaven, was arrested because of his quote-unquote suspicious walk on the street and then was released after days of interrogation. The tensions in Istanbul were so high that, fearing a riot and massacre, the head of the civic council, Mugrdechian, and the patriarchal locum tenens, Bishop Astanyan, sent a telegram to the state authorities expressing that the Armenians in Turkey condemn the actions of foreign comitages and that they stand with the Turkish state. The telegram also asked from the governmental authorities to calm down the aggressive publications of the Turkish press in Istanbul. More importantly, Armenian businessmen in Istanbul started to sell their businesses to leave for abroad, fearing a riot and looting might happen in Istanbul. By the way, the nationalist authorities in Ankara made statements about urging the Turkish press in Istanbul not to publish such unverified news, but this series of these alleged news continued to be published in Istanbul. İktam, for example, another Turkish daily, announced that the biggest enemy of Turkey was the Armenian Revolutionary Federation and Armenian Fedais, who organized secret plots to murder the leaders of the Turkish national movement. The daily further claimed that the ARF had a secret plan to intoxicate the drinking water of Istanbul, the municipal water, create fires in different districts and disturbances in the city to call foreign intervention. Even though the publications about the assassination were increasing each day in number, only 2 Armenians named Manuk and Arshak were detained by the officials. The former was imprisoned and there was not enough evidence for the latter. While the news about the assassination attempt was so fresh in the Turkish press in Istanbul, another devastating news for the Turkish society was claimed by the Tevhid-i Efkar daily, claiming that the Armenians in the Caucasus began massacring the Muslims, attacking on Muslim men, and kidnapping the Muslim children and sending them to the orphanages where they would be converted to Christianity. The daily suggested that Armenians living in Turkey, who, quote unquote, eat the Turkish bread, but side with their compatriots in the Caucasus, end quote, should be deported immediately. Another unverified news that published by the Turkish newspapers in Istanbul, such as Cumhuriyet, Tevhid, and İktam, was that, according to these news, the Armenians established society named Ararat in Bulgaria to educate and train young Armenians to establish a new generation of fedais who might target the Turkish state in the future. Furthermore, the newspapers claimed that the funding of this society was being provided by Armenians in Istanbul. Tevhid concluded, I quote, "Particularly, it is impossible to be patient when you see that the Armenians in Istanbul are betraying this country where they eat bread to such a great extent," end quote. Of course, these publications targeting the Armenian community created a continuous anxiety within the community, where the community leadership found themselves continuously making statements and announcements to express their quote-unquote loyalty to the state, to the Turkish state, and denying the participation of the Armenian community in these alleged activities. However, if one considers the Armenian businessmen who were selling their businesses to leave Istanbul, it became obvious that the publications of Turkish press and the atmosphere of insecurity created by those publications affected the community's reactions. Almost each week, the Turkish press in Istanbul published new episodes of treason, targeting particularly Armenians living in Istanbul. The news of organization of Armenian comitages killing the leaders of Turkish national movement, secret Armenian comitages who wanted to poison the municipal water of Istanbul, the Armenian state killing Muslims in the Caucasus were all linked to the Armenians living in Istanbul, calling the government to deport these Armenians and ultimately, more importantly, ultimately share their wealth with the Turkish society. As it was argued in the Turkish press, the Turkish society and nationalist cadre in Ankara clearly understood that there was no political independence without economic independence, and the center of the economy was Istanbul, with the majority of businesses in the hands of Armenian, Greek, and Jewish citizens and foreign entities. Soon, the central government in Ankara announced that certain vacancies would be reserved only for Muslim citizens, and non-Muslims were not allowed to work in some certain occupations, such as foreign banks, private corporations, and civil service. Deputy at the parliament and the journalist, a famed journalist, Falih Rıfkı, answered the issue of employment of minorities in civil service. I quote, "For example, let's consider a room from Fener. That room cannot speak Turkish and haven't renounced the Helen flag and the idea of seeing a cross on the top of Hagia Sophia one day. Just because this room was born in Istanbul, should we count him also Turk? That room can live in our land as a free man, but he needs to know that for development, the first condition is to become a Turk. Otherwise, we will assume him as a suspicious subject." As Falih Rıfkı stated, loyalty and acceptance of Turkishness was expected from the minorities if they wanted to live as equals. If not, the state would recognize them as quote-unquote suspicious subjects. Even though the Armenian community members were reluctant to express their mood of continuous anxiety, a letter from an Armenian individual sent to the government authorities, for example, portrays the dire situation of the community. I quote, "Please have a friendly approach towards us, be respectful to our domestic traveling rights and our right to protect our mother language. In a few cities, it is now forbidden to speak any language besides Turkish, and those who speak other languages will be punished. Do not close the doors of foreign and domestic corporations for us. Hire us in civil service," end quote. If not, the author argues, those Armenian students who would graduate from Armenian schools with a good knowledge of Turkish language, history, and culture would not find any jobs because of the state policies and eventually leave the country to find jobs abroad. Articles published without authors' names in this example, as in this example, provide important insights for our discussion. When Armenian authors wrote the articles as anonymous, they often criticized the nationalist policies of the state, even though the official statements of the community leadership repeatedly highlighted the loyalty of Armenians to the state and did not include any criticism. Articles signed by anonymous authors appearing in the Armenian newspapers gave us important clues regarding the collective psychology of the community. I want to conclude with an interesting incident which explains us how and under which circumstances the Armenian community accepted as quote-unquote loyal citizens by the Turkish society. The 5th anniversary of the proclamation of the Republic of Turkey, celebrated in various parts of Anatolia and Istanbul in October 1928. In Istanbul, the center of the celebrations was the Beyazıt Square. Organized by the governorship, military squads and school bands were marching from Beyazıt to the Taksim Square, passing through Divanyolu, Sultanahmet, Sirkeci, Eminönü, and Şişhane neighborhoods. While the procession was passing through Sirkeci, the crowd was standing on the two sides. When one of them standing among the crowd saw the marching of the Armenian scouts of Üsküdar, shouted out loud, "Yaşasın Ermeniler, long live Armenians." After a few seconds of silence, the whole crowd in Sirkeci started shouting "Yaşasın Ermeniler, long live Armenians," until the Armenian scouts disappeared through the bridge of Şişhane. The crowd gathered in Sirkeci were shouting "Long live Armenians" because the Armenians were participating in the celebrations of the 5th anniversary of the Republic of Turkey. Thus, they were demonstrating their quote-unquote loyalty to the state. In the eyes of Turkish society, they were welcomed as equal citizens as long as they proved their loyalty to the state and renounced their quote-unquote komitacı past. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Şekeryan, for that presentation. Very interesting because of the situation, of course, the Armenians were placed in during that period. We're going to open it up to questions and answers. So if you do have questions from the listening audience, we have a question and answer area that you can use. So please use that for questions. In the meanwhile, if any of the participants, the 3 panelists today, have a question for another one of the panelists, we maybe can start with that. So if any of you, Dr. Suciyan or or Umit have a question for each other or for Dr. Şekeryan, we can start with that while we're gathering questions from the audience. I'll start it off. I have a question for you, Adi Şekeryan. While you were studying the newspapers, in particular the Turkish newspapers of that period, did you find that there were any Turkish newspapers that took a more moderate stance? That is, they were not provoking the Armenians. Were there any newspapers at that time that were taking a more open stance to citizenship?
Yeah, as I said, this is a preliminary stage of my research. So for my PhD dissertation, I conducted research on the armistice years from 1918 to 1923, and so now I'm trying to figure out if the same policies or the same political position of the Armenian community continued after 1923. So I'm in the process of looking at this, reading the newspapers, but for now I haven't seen any newspapers that supporting, or let's say kind of showing support for the Armenian community in Istanbul, or let's say Greeks or Jews. Well, while these Turkish newspapers, such as Cumhuriyet, İktam, Tevhid Efkar, Tevhid, Son Telegraph, these newspapers had great circulations in Istanbul. So all of these newspapers targeted non-Muslim populations. Interestingly, in Ankara, Hakimiyet-i Milliye Daily, published by the Turkish National Movement in Ankara, they kind of tried to, let's say, calm down the publications of Istanbul press. And several times, Ministry of Interior, for example, made announcements that these news were not, these were unverified news, urging the Turkish press in Istanbul not to publish such news. But I am not sure if they, their announcements came like 1 week after those events. Cumhuriyet published an article about this assassination attempt, and then you don't see any announcements from Ankara, like let's say 1 week, and then after 1 week they made a statement that these were unverified news. Please stop publishing these news, etc. So I'm not sure if they it was a tactical movement, or they really know about it.
Okay, and now there's a question for Dr. Suciyan from Hrag Varjabedian. Why did the Turkish government overlook the study of Turkish peasants?
Well, I don't think that they overlooked the study of Turkish peasants, but the thing is that after the annihilation of Armenians and the exile of Greeks, there was a new situation in the villages, and this new situation had to be controlled. I think the governments in Turkey in the first decades until the mid-20th century, even afterwards, they were more concerned about controlling the villagers. And I think all their studies, why they see the development of village, or understanding the village is central for the development of the whole society, etc. These all tell us that their basic concern was to control the peasants and village populations, especially, of course, in the eastern provinces, because that was the most uncontrollable place in the country. So they did collect, gather data on the villages, but or on the villagers, but these data was not made available.
And I just have a follow-up myself, because it seems to me that already in the 1870s and 1880s, when you talked about the peasants, but for the Armenians already, the status of the peasants and land was a huge issue, wasn't it? So
Sure.
Already it was something
Sure.
that was already in the picture.
Sure. I mean, by mid-1850s, we have constant petitions sent from the peasants to Istanbul and to the Patriarchate and to the Ottoman government, and they're talking about land seizures, land confiscations, that they are pushed out from their villages. And this is the case of Çarsancak, for instance, starts from 1855, if I'm not mistaken, and it finishes in 1915. So we can assume that, and we know that there are various, there were similar situations almost all provinces wherever Armenians used to live. So yes, the land issue starts with almost with the Tanzimat, 1830s, 39 or 40, but basically it's the land code 1858 which really starts to make things even more difficult for the Armenians. Yes.
Okay, do we have other questions? I have a question for Dr. Kurt regarding you were talking about the laws. So during the period of the Ottoman Empire, immediately during and after the genocide were the abandoned properties laws, but you said that the new Republican government pretty much confirmed those laws and never overturned them. Is that right? And then were there other laws as well that they implemented as well to continue the process of taking over land and property? You're on mute still, so you need to unmute.
Still getting used to it.
There you go.
Yes, that's correct, and it's a really good point. As we know, from 1915 to 1918, there were these abandoned property laws, Lakyal Abrakner, and also and the abandoned property commissions, which were turned into liquidation commissions in September 1915, and after the armistice, there was a short period of restitution process, at least attempts to restitute the properties of movable, especially immobile properties of Armenians to their original owners. And this process was accelerated in 1920, immediately after aftermath of the Sev Treaty. And when the Kemalist government became the upper hand, and in 1922 first, they rescinded these regulations and laws which provided restitution for Armenians. They rescinded and all these laws, and then brought CUP so-called legal mechanisms back by revising them according to the circumstances of the time. Also brought new laws and regulations for the Armenians who managed to stay in different parts of Anatolia during the national liberation period, not only confiscating the properties of deported Armenians from 1915 through 1918, they also managed to liquidate actually the properties of Armenians who were in Turkey from 1919 through 1921 as well. And then it continued, and there were even cases in the Constitutional Court in Turkey in 1960s and 70s, and all these cases were resulted in negatively, or resulted in for the sake of the Turkish state as well. So they kept these laws and regulations intact until 1980s in order to make sure that there was no disputed property for any Armenian heir to claim or to reclaim. That's why these properties were on the ground. That's why created this mechanisms under the veil of law.
Okay. Do any of the panelists have any questions for each other at all? I don't see any other questions from the audience. So we had three excellent presentations today. Each, I think, presented new and ongoing research into really the topic of our discussion of our conference, which was the state of the art of the early Turkish Republic period. So I want to thank each of you, Dr. Suciyan, Dr. Kurt, Dr. Şekeryan, for your presentation. Thank you, Umit, for co-sponsoring or co-organizing this very interesting conference. And I think together with the panelists from yesterday, the papers will make for a very interesting volume, which will again give us really the state of the art of the early Turkish Republic period, historiography, sources, and future directions. I want to thank again the Society for Armenian Studies for their co-sponsorship as well, and the support of our groups here at Fresno. And thank you very much. So we'll see everyone, and thank you for joining us for our conference.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.